Hello and welcome dear students. In today's lecture, we will be discussing or comparing authoritarian system with special reference to China and Russia. Let us first talk about what is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism simply means blind submission to authority as opposed to individual freedom of thought and action. In government, authoritarianism denotes any political system that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or small elite that is not constitutionally responsible to the body of the people. Authoritarian leaders often exercise power arbitrarily and without regard to existing bodies of law, and they usually cannot be replaced by citizens choosing freely among various competitors in elections. The freedom to create opposition political parties or other alternative political groupings with which to compete for power with the ruling group is either limited or non-existent in authoritarian regimes. It is in essence negation of democracy. When power is based on consent, respected willingly and recognized by wider masses, it is legitimate and binding. This is called authority. Authority is power raised in a moral or ethical level. Since authority requires the proper use of power, it might be said to come from below. Democratic governments uphold this kind of power and are in charge. However, a regime can be described as authoritarian if it uses force to exert power and does so against the will of the people. Authoritarianism therefore refers to the notion or practice of administration from above. Government from above is also linked to monarchical absolutism, conventional dictatorships, the majority of one-party system, and majority of military regimes. They are also authoritarian in the sense that they care about suppressing political freedom and resistance. Totalitarian governments are set apart from authoritarian ones. Totalitarian regimes portray modern dictatorships as a model of government that completely centralizes and uniformly regulates all facets of political, social, and intellectual life, far surpassing earlier manifestations of absolute or autocratic, despotic, or tyrannical regimes and their ability to command and organize the populace. In this regard, totalitarianism is genuinely a 20th century phenomena. The term has been applied to the three radical dictatorial regimes of the interwar period, that is Italian fascism, German National Socialism, and Stalinism in Russia. It follows that though totalitarian regimes are authoritarian, all authoritarian regimes are not necessarily totalitarian. No doubt, the authoritarian regimes are concerned with the repression of opposition and political liberty. However, unlike the totalitarian regimes, these regimes do not aim to achieve far more radical goal of obliterating the distinction between the state and civil society. Authoritarian regimes tend to tolerate a significant range of economic, religious, and other freedoms. Dear students, let us now briefly talk about the authoritarianism in China. The People's Republic of China was formed in 1949 from a country which was crippled by poverty, internal and external conflict, and has grown into one of today's economic superpowers. Firstly, there is clear evidence that China does not have freedom of thought and freedom of action as seen in the case of Liu Xiaobo, the political activist who has been a vocal critic of the Chinese regime and who has been imprisoned since 2008 for inciting subversion of state power. The fact that Chinese citizens were detained, interrogated, and harassed in the run-up to Human Rights Day in 2008, and famously the Tiananmen Square massacre. Secondly, the highest parts of the Chinese leadership cannot be chosen by citizens choosing freely among various competitors in elections as the system outlined by the Chinese constitution only has citizens voting at the lowest levels of government, with the members of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress being elected by the National People's Congress. This is the highest organ of state power, and Chinese citizens have no control over its members or its decisions. The Chinese single party political system is another way in which China falls within the bounds of an authoritarian state, as the freedom to create opposition political parties does not exist, while in the Second Amendment of the Constitution it is implied that China has a multi-party system. The rest of the document clearly outlines a system where the Communist Party of China is firmly in charge. The next part of the definition that authoritarian governments usually have no highly developed guiding ideology. Clearly, China does not fall into this category, as the unique ideology of socialism with Chinese characteristics developed from Marxism, Leninism and Mao Zedong thought is very highly developed guiding ideology. From the point of view of this definition, China is clearly an authoritarian state. However, the situation is much more complex, and in order to understand China, socialism with Chinese characteristics must be understood. According to the Chinese government, socialism with Chinese characteristics refers to three distinct fronts. The economic fronts, where China sticks to a multi-ownership oriented basic market economic system with the public ownership in the dominions. Its political fronts, China upholds a system of the People's Congress, a system of multi-party cooperation and political consultation, and a system of regional ethnic autonomy. And culturally, China keeps its socialist value system at the core of social trends, while respecting differences, and China's history is very important in understanding why China operates in the way it does. The majority of China's history is dominated by the imperial era, and for the majority of the period, China was ahead of Europe in a number of ways. Feudalism died out in China in 207 BC, but it lasted until the 14th century in Europe. By the 1500s, China had an unparalleled transport infrastructure consisting of nearly 30 highways, over 50 main roads, and a dense network of canals and rivers. The Treaty of Nanjing, that forced China to allow opium to be sold throughout China, pay Britain's war costs, and ceded Hong Kong to the British Empire. This disastrous treaty was the beginning of the century of humiliation that has defined modern China more than any other period of Chinese history. During this period, China was shaken by internal strife such as the Muslim revolts and the Taiping rebellion. The final humiliation was the invasion of mainland China by Japan and subsequent occupation that lasted until the end of the Second World War in 1945. After the destructive power of the Second World War, China was again savaged by civil war, this time between the nationalists and communists. Eventually, the communists were victorious, seizing control of mainland China, while the nationalist leadership fled to Taiwan. Without wishing to oversimplify this situation, Chinese politics today has two very important historical features: nostalgia for the greatness of the Chinese imperial period and an extremely strong desire to avoid any future repeat of the century of humiliation China is. Strictly speaking, an authoritarian state with a government that does not allow freedom of thought or freedom of action places power into the hands of a small elite that is not democratically responsible. The citizens of China wields power arbitrarily, cannot be replaced by citizens choosing among various competitors in elections, and does not allow alternative political parties or political groupings to compete for power. There is plenty of evidence for the Chinese government not allowing freedom of thought and freedom of action. However, there is one example that stands out above the rest, and that is the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, where hundreds, maybe thousands of students, locals and other supporters were killed by the Chinese government in their attempt to disperse the crowds. The structure of the Chinese government shows how the communist leadership is not democratically responsible to the Chinese people. The people have no say over the membership of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, the highest organ of state power, nor do the people have control over the National People's Congress, the body that votes on the membership of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. The lack freedom to create alternative political groupings in which to compete for power is another clear area where China falls into the authoritarian group, as China is a monoparty government, and while in the constitution mention is made of a multi-party system, there is only one party in reality and no other groups can compete for power. Another negative for the Chinese political system is the fact that voters have no official system of contact with their representative. China's backwardness at the beginning of the 20th century meant that there was no basis for the spontaneous class revolution that Marx stated was the way for communism to take hold. So, instead, Lenin's view that the Communist Party would have to actively lead the revolution was favored, resulting in Marxism-Leninism. Also the fact that the Chinese peasants were actively hostile to the idea of collectivization, a key idea in the Soviet style of communism, meant that Mao had to develop a system that redistributes the land and also respected property rights and lowered taxes. This unique ideology has only grown more complex over time, particularly with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping that have so far successfully integrated capitalism with Chinese communism. An important factor in Chinese politics is fear. As was early discussed, the century of humiliation is settled and open wound to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. The fear of a return to that period in Chinese history is a powerful motivating factor for Chinese politicians in pursuit of their foreign policy goals. Under communist leadership, China has once again risen to become one of the most powerful states in global politics, particularly economically, and this makes the communist government very attractive to a large number of Chinese citizens as they remember the century of humiliation that the Communist Party seemed to save them from. In short, China is not a democratic state by any stretch of the imagination. It is sometimes brutal, has a system of democracy that is a long way from the democracy of Western states such as that seen in Great Britain, is frequently guilty of suppressing freedom of thought and action, has a small elite in power that is not accountable to the Chinese public and does not allow other political parties to challenge the Communist Party for leadership of China. Dear students, let us now talk about the authoritarianism in Russia. We know that in January 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, analysts and observers inside Russia and out anticipated the rise of democracy and open politics in a country whose history had only known authoritarianism. The demise of communism had brought transformation toward democracy and market capitalism to many of the states of East Central Europe, and same was expected to occur in Russia. Indeed, it was liberalizing reforms under the last Soviet leader Mikhail S. Gorbachev that triggered the eventual collapse of communist regimes. Then Russia's new charismatic populist leader, President Boris N. Yeltsin, emphatically proclaimed Russia to be the most significant cog in a new global wave of democratization that would unite Europe. On the surface, actions seem to confirm these hopes with the adoption of a new constitution, competitive elections for representative bodies at the national, regional and local levels, and for leaders such as the president, governors and mayors, and the rise of an entirely free and vibrant print and electronic mass media. The economic sphere mirrored these social and political changes with establishment of free markets and privatization of former state enterprises. International affirmation came with Russia's inclusion in a new G8 grouping, expanded cooperation with NATO and a wide range of new global political and economic partnerships. The end of the Cold War brought euphoria over a new era of globalization and democratization, expressed in such events as the coalition to oppose Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, Nelson Mandela's release from prison, and the end of apartheid in South Africa, and myriad other examples of which Russia's democratization seemed the inevitable culmination. But this optimism masked the challenging realities of Russian politics, and by 2000 the hopes were firmly dashed when Yeltsin resigned and appointed a former KGB official as President of Russia. Vladimir V. Putin immediately took advantage of a lack of constitutional and institutional protections and dismantled all vestiges of democracy, restoring Russia to an increasingly strong and uncompromising authoritarian regime. Putin, then the Prime Minister, initially received the presidency on an acting basis from the retiring Boris Yeltsin at the end of 1999. He served 2 4-year presidential terms from 2000 to 2008 and then remained the de facto paramount leader while working as Prime Minister until he returned to the presidency in 2012, violating the spirit, if not the letter of the Constitution's 2-term limit. A 2008 constitutional amendment extended presidential terms to 6 years, and a 2020 amendment allowed Vladimir Putin to run for an additional 2 terms, meaning he could remain in office until 2036. Opposition politicians and activists are frequently targeted with fabricated criminal cases and other forms of administrative harassment designed to prevent their participation in the political process. Navalny was poisoned with a toxic Nehru agent in August 2020 while he was investigating corruption and campaigning in Siberia, with evidence later emerging that the attack was carried out by the Federal Security Service. He had to be evacuated to Germany to prevent the authorities from interfering with his treatment, and he was arrested upon his return in January 2021 for violating probation, receiving a prison term in February. Legislation enacted in June 2021 banned individuals associated with extremist organizations from running for election. The Central Election Commission subsequently disqualified a number of candidates who were accused of extremism or association with undesirable organizations. Other opposition activists were sentenced to prison or fled the country due to charges they said were politically motivated. Among other new restrictions, Russian citizens who hold a second citizenship or a foreign residence permit and people who have been found guilty of one of 400 criminal and administrative offences were unable to run for office as of 2021. In June 2021, Golos reported that around 9 million Russians, or nearly 1 in 10 adults, had effectively been denied the right to run for any public office. Russia's numerous security agencies work to maintain tight control over society and prevent any political challenges to the incumbent regime. The country's leadership is also closely intertwined with powerful business magnates who benefit from government patronage in exchange for political loyalty and various forms of service. The Russian Orthodox Church similarly works to support the status quo, receiving financial support and a privileged status in return. Recent reports from the Riga-based online news outlet Medzoa, echoing other research, have shown that many employers, particularly in the public sector, pressure their employees to vote partly to deliver the government's desired level of voter turnout. Women are underrepresented in politics and government. As of 2021, they held less than a fifth of the seats in the State Duma and the Federation Council. Only about a tenth of cabinet members are women, and many issues of importance to women are not prominent in Russian politics. Constitutional amendments that were approved in the 2020 referendum and enacted in April 2021 formally defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman, both reflecting and deepening the systematic challenges LGBT plus people face in pursuing their political interests. Russia's authoritarian president dominates the political system along with powerful allies in the security services and the business sector. These groups effectively control the output of the parliament, which is not freely elected. The 2020 constitutional amendments formalized the power of the president over the legislature and allow Vladimir Putin to retain the presidency until 2036, demonstrating his ability to manipulate the system. In 2021, the parliament passed a series of bills designed to increase political centralization at the expense of regional autonomy. However, the federal authorities have limited ability to impose policy decisions in Chechnya, where Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has been granted unchecked power in exchange for violently suppressing dissent and keeping the republic within the Russian Federation. Corruption in the government and the business world is pervasive, and a growing lack of accountability enables officials to engage in malfeasance with impunity. Many analysts have argued that the political system is essentially a kleptocracy, a regime whose defining characteristic is the plunder of public wealth by ruling elites. Some of these elites openly work to fulfill President Putin's policy aims and receive government contracts and protection from prosecution in return for their loyalty. There is little transparency and accountability in the day-to-day workings of the government. Decisions are adopted behind closed doors by a small group of individuals whose identities are often unclear to the public and are announced to the population after the fact. Although the Constitution provides for freedom of speech, vague laws on extremism grant the authorities great discretion to crack down on any speech or any organization or any activity that lacks official support. The government controls directly or through state-owned companies and friendly business magnates all of the national television networks and many radio and print outlets, as well as most of the media advertising market. A handful of independent outlets still operate, most of them online and some headquartered abroad. The few still based in the country struggle to maintain their independence from state interests. Television remains the most popular source of news, but its influence is declining particularly among young people who rely more on social media. Thus, we can summarize that power in Russia's authoritarian political system is concentrated in the hands of President Vladimir Putin, with loyalist security forces, a subservient judiciary, a controlled media environment, and a legislature consisting of a ruling party and pliable opposition factions. The Kremlin manipulates elections and suppresses genuine dissent. Rampant corruption facilitates shifting links among state officials and organized crime groups. Dear students, to conclude today's lecture, we can say that we were able to understand the meaning of authoritarianism and also how authoritarianism in China and Russia flourished. Additionally, we have also discussed how people in these countries are being suppressed by not allowing them to speak freely and express their dissent. Additionally, we highlighted corruption and other challenges in these countries. Thank you, dear students, for watching this lecture patiently, and I hope you would have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you.